Thanks very much, Catherine, for that wonderful introduction. I'll have to remember that for next time I have to introduce you. Illustrious, I like that. But firstly, I too would like to acknowledge the Indigenous people on whose land I'm working today, the Wurundjeri people and other peoples of the Kulin Nations upon which Monash works, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge the Australian Research Council, which funded the project, which this paper is derived from. And my colleagues on that include Lenore Manderson from the University of the Witwatersrand, Corinne Hamerberg from Monash University, and Trudy Gerrits, who is also from University of Amsterdam, and also Cal Volks, who is a research associate on this project. Now, this project, you may notice, has a DP20 number on it, but we're actually only just completed our first year, and that was due to COVID. Both restrictions in Australia and South Africa made this a very delayed project. So if you're wondering why it's such an early project, that's why. Just to give you a bit of background as to what we've been doing, the project included, so far we've completed 87 interviews from January to, well, across last year basically. And this has included a variety of informants from right across sub-Saharan Africa, including South Africa, where the majority are, Uganda, Mozambique, Namibia, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Cameroon, Zambia, and Ghana. And this has included interviews and observation site visits to 3 public and 6 private clinics in South Africa that occurred last year. And of those, we've sort of identified 9 what we call FIFO staff. I'll talk about that shortly. But many other people talk about and commented upon these practices. In 2022, we visited 9 clinics in Pretoria, Johannesburg, Nelspruit, and also Cape Town. Now, fundamentally behind this paper is this question of what kinds of labour goes into maintaining, altering, and profiting from the transnational markets and bioeconomies of reproductive industry and pharmaceutical enterprise. So our concentration has been particularly on new forms of labour that have arisen with globalised reproductive travel. Now, just to give you some context for those of you who may not be that familiar with sub-Saharan Africa and reproductive travel, as yet there's been very little academic work done in sub-Saharan Africa on reproductive technologies per se, assisted reproduction, despite there being some really major repro hubs in South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana and Nigeria. And as you see, between 2013 and 2017, ART procedures were reported from 73 centres in 18 countries across Africa. So the sort of global assemblage of assisted reproductive technologies has certainly disseminated across Africa. Of these, the most important in sub-Saharan Africa is South Africa. And it has 22 clinics which are considered centres of excellence by SASREG, which is the South African Society for Reproductive Medicine and Gynecological Endoscopy. And then there's at least another 8 clinics where other fertility specialists consult. And of the private clinics in South Africa, 8 have websites which specifically target cross-border patients, both from across sub-Saharan Africa and neighbouring countries, as well as from Europe, the US, and Australia. And this is relevant to our discussion here, is that in South Africa, there are only 3 public clinics which offer training for a limited number of laboratory scientists and IVF specialists, and that's from across sub-Saharan Africa. So what I'll be talking about in this presentation is the movements of staff. Now, we're used to talking and thinking about the movements of patients in international medical travel and reproductive travel. But in this, we're also looking at the movements of clinical specialists, and these are people like the fertility specialists, embryologists in particular, and also gamete couriers are another subgroup. And these are forms of labour that assist to develop, to maintain, and create profit from the transnational markets and the bioeconomies of reproductive industries. And our argument is that this mobility is not just constituting a new form of work, but also it has consequences for the organisation of work within the clinics. A major impact of working with visiting embryologists, for example, is that the IVF procedures and the patients all have to be organised around the presence of the embryologist. And this implies that the work is organised in batches of patients. So that's something that I'll be talking about later, is this process of batching. Now, in terms of talking about the mobilities of reproductive staff, there's very little written about the movements of clinician and other specialists. Now, there was an example with Horst and Gerrit's work. So that's Trudy, who's a co-author on this paper. And their fieldwork in Uganda and Ghana showed the importance of the transnational professional networks that staff had, and how clinics were actually these spaces where clinicians, often from other countries, would come for short periods of time, impart some knowledge, show some new skills, disseminate information, and then return. Some of these were on a regular basis to provide the actual ART services. So they describe a Ghanaian clinic which had monthly visits by the same embryologist from the UK. It had monthly visits from rotating embryologists from Africa and European countries. And it really was quite a blamage, if you like, of different nationalities all coming together in this space and often negotiating their practices and their ways of doing things. Elsewhere, this has been referred to as a flying circus of international embryologists. A term that I've used to describe this is fly in, fly out care, and that's the term I'll be talking about later as well. And Bob Simpson's work in Sri Lanka talked about IVF troubadours, which has a sort of a musical flair to it. But other than that, there's basically nothing else written on these mobilities of reproductive staff. Now, in this paper, alongside their motivations to provide what they term access and care, the decisions by clinics to expand services to other countries through satellite clinics, we argue, are essentially economic ones, and they're based upon opportunities to expand control of a market. One of the things which we argue is that these operations of mobile reproductive staff who are servicing these satellite clinics often can only give a very pared down service. So they may not be able to give andrology services, PGD, there's no gynecological surgery, and there's no vitrification of ova or embryos available. So let's look into this in a little bit more detail. So if we think about the different types of mobilities, the first is what we term mobile knowledges. Most of the training that occurs on an ongoing basis for infertility specialists across the world really involves training overseas at some point. So whilst some of our specialists trained in South Africa, nearly all of them had at some time gone for specialist courses to the US or to Italy, and this was the same too of the embryologists. Likewise, many of them had provided sporadic training at various places across Africa. And what this often meant was that clinics in other parts of Africa would get a series of short-term inputs by visiting IVF specialists or visiting embryologists. And this sometimes led to slight tensions and conflicts over exactly how things were to be done over practices, because everybody has their own little way, particularly the embryologists, they all have their little way of doing things. And so you often had these serial inputs. The other pattern that we see in types of mobility is this regular travel. And this is what we term the FIFO specialists. And this can range from driving 6.5 hours every 2 months for a 10 to 12 day period of assisted reproductive work at a satellite clinic in another country, to constant rotations flying between countries, say as an embryologist providing services in a range of different clinics. So that's a regular form of FIFO mobility. And then what I won't be talking about today, but which is the subject of another paper, is what you might see as extreme mobility. And this involves gamete couriers who are constantly on the move, doing long haul flights and inter-European trips, moving gametes around the world. But I won't be talking about them today. So what is FIFO labour then? I'll just come back to that term, because FIFO labour, as anyone who's from Australia here understands, it's a term that's derived from the labour practices of extractive industries of the Australian mining sector, where miners literally fly in and fly out, although sometimes not necessarily flying per se, but coming in and spending very short periods of intense work at geographically isolated locations, and then returning to their homes for breaks in between. And so what this means is that you have this constantly rotating shifts of staff to work in the mines without any great elaborate physical and social infrastructures that would be required were they to actually live in these very remote areas permanently. So it allows for mining to take place in locations which otherwise lack the skilled workforce for this purpose. So in applying this term to assisted reproduction, we're deliberately drawing upon the suggestions of the work of travelling clinicians and embryologists and scientists as being involved in a form of extractive industry, which involves the transformation of raw material, in this case, the bio-value of bodies, to create economic values, which is profit, while at the same time also creating effective values. So things like care, the experience of pregnancy, children, and parenthood. And such travel takes place both to expand clinics' reaches into places where there's a shortage of local medical expertise and hence create increased access, but also there is this dual logic of economic profit and improving access, which organises this work. So let's just have a look at a statement from a clinical director in Uganda who explained their clinic's decision to expand their services to Tanzania, Rwanda, and Zambia. And here she's very straightforward. She said that it came down to how many patients from those countries we were seeing at a local branch. So the more patients we saw from Tanzania, that gave us an indication, okay, there's demand there. And so then we'd start a new branch, because she says the initial startup capital wasn't too much. You just start as a clinic and you're able to test the market, so to speak. So it wasn't a huge barrier to do that. And so she said that's how the decisions were made, depending on the countries where they saw the most patients from. Then they also considered things like population size, paying power, and at the end of the day, IVF is costly, so they need people who have the income to be able to pay for it. And then also because they're a foreign entity, they needed to check out the local rules around investing in a country. How can the money move? Because it does eventually need to be able to move around for them to make profit. And what's the tolerance from employing international staff in that particular facility? So she said those were all the sort of legal and logistical considerations that come into expanding a market. From the point of view of the actual workers, the IVF specialists and the embryologists, there's a few things which they said about this moving as part of their work. Olivia who was an embryologist, she's also now a gamete courier, she said that she actually just likes traveling. She loves going to and experiencing travel, and always wanted to go and work and live in different cultures and understand really how they tick. One of the IVF specialists who regularly travels to Namibia said that for him, because he's not doing gynecological surgery, he's just doing pickups of ova and over extractions and then embryo transfers. He said for him, it's a much more laid back day. So he'd probably be done, if it's a busy day, he'd probably done by 4, whereas his days in the South African clinic are much, much longer days. And finally, they all talked about that they saw this work as providing access to people who otherwise may not get access. So there's a lot of work going on trying to get the sort of facilities and those things available to people who otherwise would not reach them. So that's how they view this work. But there are a few consequences of the organisation of the work of an IVF clinic, which involves FIFO staff. Now, the motivation behind this is that across sub-Saharan Africa, there's a shortage of specialist staff, both IVF specialists and particularly embryologists. And so to take advantage of the short periods of time when they are available in, say, a satellite clinic, you have to use batching. And batching is the practice of using hormone regimes to synchronize patients' menstrual cycles to allow for a whole cohort of women to undergo ART treatments within a set period of time so that extractions and transfers can be done when the fertility specialist and the embryologists are available. Batching has another term as well. For those of you who work in IVF clinics, you know it can also refer to batching over, but we're talking here about the batching of a cohort of patients. So what's it look like? One of the embryologists said, they'd see about 15 or 20 or 30 patients, even more than that. And then they go and they get feedback from their patients. Yes, doctor, I'll be available in June. So you collect all the patients who can be available in June 2022, and then you start putting them on the treatment, the initial part of the treatment, which is like the oral contraceptive. They'll be on that for a month or so. And then as soon as that stops, then the real clinical treatment starts. So they're put on their hormones and trying now to navigate them to fall exactly on those dates that we've planned for June when they're going to travel in and do extractions and transfers. So it's about the logistics of trying to make all of these different technologies, personnel, hormones, people's bodies, everything all come together in, what Charis Thompson talked about, the sort of choreography, the ontological choreography of all of that internationally through a practice like batching. So Billy, who's an embryologist from Eastern Africa, described his working regime traveling across several countries. And he said in the first 10 days, Kampala is our biggest centre. And we were doing between 45 to 60 cases on a monthly basis, which was significant. And then so we'd do those within 10 days. We were doing clinic stage transfers on day 3. Okay, so they're letting the embryos grow and then they're doing the transfers on day 3. But again, that's because we needed to be somewhere else. And then the next place was Tanzania. The numbers were not that many. We were doing between 10 or 15 patients or cases, and sometimes 20 cases in Tanzania. So we could do all of those within a 5 to 6 day period. Then Zambia was midway, sometimes 25 to 30 cases. So basically it was back to back. In a 30-day period, we'd spend about 23 days doing the work in different countries and then 7 days preparing for the next whole cycle. And he said a lot of the problems are around the logistics. In terms of the ability to do work, that was okay. I mean, it was exciting. Always been on the plane to another country, a different place. In between, we had a chance to go to national parks and to all those places. So much of the work was hectic, but there was a reward that you were going to see new things and meet new people. Okay, so there he's describing his regime where essentially he's on the move 23 days of the month, doing this constant cycles. So what does this actually look like? And here we have a notion of reproduction as being about efficiency, about how is the most efficient way to organise a clinic and all the inputs and the patients so that you can get the most patients done in the most efficient manner. So batching is the way in which this is done, and this is a batch calendar. Here they're saying 4 to 5 patients, but as you heard from that, this is done on a much grander scale than that. And it's crucial, we argue, not only to allow this sort of ART to take place in the shortage, with the shortage of embryologists and IVF specialists, but also it's crucial to the profitability of these clinics. Now, one of the IVF specialists said, so it's not an easy thing. It's an easy way to run cycles effectively, but should you run into problems, then you've got big problems. In addition, there's always the risks of interruptions in batch IVF, including in relation to laboratory issues, power failures or contamination, where this affects an entire cohort of patients for that cycle. Now, those are real issues in sub-Saharan Africa, where sometimes laboratory conditions can be less than ideal. For instance, at the moment, you might be aware that there are constant power load shedding that takes place in South Africa every day. There's periods of time when the power isn't working. So if you can imagine that across sub-Saharan Africa, in many places, people have got generators, they're checking to see that the incubators are still working at the appropriate levels when the generators kick in. So there's a whole range of things which could go wrong. What I find interesting about this chart too is that only actually one person appears right down the bottom. The availability of the embryologist is the crucial person in this batch calendar. And their work and where they are is also determined by this temporal organisation of the cycle. Now, batching is by no means without controversy. And whilst many clinics in South Africa do batching for their satellite clinics, and many clinics, as you heard, across sub-Saharan Africa do batching because it means they have set inputs and it's easy to organise everything. Several specialists are against batching, and this is one IVF specialist who said that he was very much against that kind of batching system, not because of going there for a short time, but the fact that there's no follow-up. He said that batching's a very lucrative thing to do for the doctor and the embryologist because they go into a vulnerable community that doesn't have an IVF service. So you walk in there and the patient thinks this is automatically going to be successful. So they'll happily come and spend their money there and stuff. And these people will make a ton of money for doing those 20 or 30 people, and then they'll leave. But that's a terrible service for the patient, because when they're gone, and again, there's no follow-up, that patient doesn't really know what's going on. They've obviously often paid a lot more than they should even because they're vulnerable and all that kind of thing. So one has to be very careful with that whole batching story, that it's done in an ethical way and that there's proper follow-up. And then he went on to talk about that there were horror stories about embryos that weren't vitrified properly, or they were just left there, that they didn't top up the tanks properly and the embryos die. And he said, so if you're not running a centre properly with an embryologist in charge all the time, it's not just the actual IVF, It's what about all the frozen embryos? And if you're not freezing embryos, then you're doing a massive disservice to a patient. And there he's referring to the fact that if a woman goes through a whole IVF cycle and produces a number of viable embryos, but then may only have one or two transferred to her and has other embryos, if you can vitrify those embryos, then she doesn't need to go through another whole cycle to try to produce embryos again if the first cycle fails. But if you don't have vitrification, you're actually condemning that patient to have to go through IVF again and again. And given that many of these women have serious reproductive issues, you're really denying them chances of success in their IVF. So he said, so these kinds of short-term interventions, like I quickly come and do a thing and I don't know if it's so great, that this is really doing a disservice to their patients. And he said that they're getting shortchanged in terms of what they get. Oops, and it's not moving forward now. Okay. I'll just have to put that back on. For some reason, it's not moving forward. So I hope that has been moving forward through the presentation. Okay, so I've got a little technical difficulty my end. How are we going for time, Catherine?
We've got about 5 minutes left, Andrea.
Oh, perfect. Okay, well, I'll get my presentation back up and see if we can bring you to the end of it. Sorry about this. Always got to be something happen on Zoom, isn't there? Okay. Here we go. So the final thing that I want to really say is that this production logic of batching, which involves the efficient organisation of the staff, of bodies, of time and resources, whilst people talk about it as providing access, in actuality, it doesn't necessarily provide access and care to patients in locations with few facilities or specialists. What it does provide is a one-size-fits-all model, which necessarily entails compromises, which actually goes against the ethos of personalised care that most reproductive specialists aim to practice. It allows for a very limited number of fertility specialists and embryologists to travel to a clinic and provide their services and expertise for a limited period of time. It involves the efficient use of time, of drugs and materials. But in fact, it also has a number of disadvantages, particularly for the patient. If there is an adverse event of some sort, there is the risk that a patient is left without any backup care of a fertility specialist or a gynecologist to seek care. It's very disadvantageous for women who mightn't respond to what the standard hormonal protocol is for the batching, or for those who may need vitrification, andrology services, or other things such as PGD. And if something goes wrong in the lab, the entire cohort, and in this case, we might be talking 45 cycles, will be lost. So it really calls, I guess, into stark relief the conundrum which faces assisted reproductive treatments in sub-Saharan Africa, and that is how to maintain high quality assisted reproductive services whilst increasing access. I'd suggest that the studies of this mobile organisation of clinicians and embryologists really offers insights into modalities of value creation in a corporate model which now relies on mobilities and the worker collaboration in those mobilities. It manifests in specialists' willingness to travel either in terms of serial contacts with various clinics or on these regular rotations to satellite clinics that are located outside the major repro hubs. We might call this, again, to pick up Thompson's term, international ontological choreography. And the batching, and in our other paper, the gamete careers, really illustrate this notion where you're striving to bring the specialists, the female bodies, the gametes, the technologies, everything, the culture media, the shippers with the nitrogen at the proper temperature and the proper quantity, all together at the right time. But at the same time, these shouldn't, I think, get confused with necessarily providing access per se. What they do very well is create value and profit for clinic shareholders through efficiently increasing the turnover of standardized cycles in the expanded reach that travel allows. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.